Risk of Rain 2013 is one of those bizarre lightning in a bottle indie games that's commonly seen in many indie enthusiasts' Steam libraries. It's one of those games that everyone seems to have heard of, although probably not played themselves. Sadly, it's also one of those games that, all too common for indie passion projects, suffers from its fair share of technical issues. Things that a game creator with no prior experience would likely run into. As you are undoubtedly aware, Risk of Rain Returns recently hit virtual shelves on Steam. While at face value it might seem odd to remake a game that's only 10 years old, Risk of Rain 2013 definitely needed it. For starters, if you wanted to actually play with friends, you'd need to be a master of the ancient and long-forgotten art of port forwarding. Obviously, this would turn off a lot of would-be players from enjoying the game in a group. Then, the bugs. One particularly egregious example was this item called the Hyperthreader, that would spawn an additional laser projectile for every hit you inflicted upon your enemies. The only problem was, these projectiles would never be deleted, even if they missed and flew off screen, which meant that this item would consistently cause memory leaks. And finally, the general instability of the game was another issue. While it was, admittedly, kind of satisfying to see your frame rate inevitably drop lower and lower as the amount of projectiles on the screen grew higher and higher, it definitely made the game unplayable past a certain point. That's assuming, of course, it didn't crash. So, that's what justifies Risk of Rain Returns' existence. The thing is, I personally didn't expect it to be much more than a simple remake of Risk of Rain, minus the crashes, bugs, etc., and with a lick of new pixelated paint. But there's just so much more to this game that's really blown me away. The new items, the 3 new survivors, the Providence Trials, and of course, all the little things. Balances, reinvigorations of bland or less interesting items, more interactables to discover, more drones, more secrets, and much more. If you've never heard of Risk of Rain as a franchise before, it's something that I consider to be a genre-defining roguelike. Before its existence, mechanics like an ever-increasing difficulty hadn't really been seen before, and beyond that, the game just had this intriguing sense of mystery that was extremely enticing. It featured a logbook system that had a little snippet of text associated with every item in the game. Most, hell, probably 99% of these are unimportant, referencing random events in this intriguing universe of little to no relevance, but instead providing some backstory or insight into the associated item itself. Rather, it was the world itself that had this grand sense of enigma to it. Why are all these monsters attacking me and not each other? Who is this funny looking fella in the intro cutscene, and why did they destroy the contact light? Unfortunately, this feeling of the unknown is something that the current owners of the game's IP evidently don't feel is important. But for me and many others, we were drawn in by the unique and fast-paced roguelike gameplay, and we stayed for the universe and the feeling that we were merely small players in a big, big game we didn't understand. The gameplay consists of you crash landing on the planet in an escape pod, fighting monsters and collecting the money that they drop, and then using that money to crack open various cargo crates rained down onto the pockmarked surface by the space freighter you yourself were riding upon. Inside these crates are items, or in universe, packages sent from planet to planet by whoever, a personal memento, a weapon of war, or something else. Picking these up will permanently bind them to your character, and this will be your source of power for the majority of the game. There is also an XP and leveling system, and while this does also play a major role in your survivability, it's not really something you'll be aware of during a game. With these items and your chosen survivor's 4 abilities, you would face off against increasingly difficult monsters and areas, both you and the environment becoming progressively more dangerous as the game timer ticked up. Something that Risk of Rain Returns does excellently, despite the updated graphics and new content, is feel almost exactly like Risk of Rain 1. It's hard to pinpoint why or how, but rediscovering the game and all its secrets felt very similar to when I did so playing the original, as a 13-year-old on a shitty laptop. Obviously, some big contributors are the music, which is largely the same minus some remastering and new collab tracks, and the updated pixel art that matches the original style quite well, just with a lot more in the way of visual fidelity. Watching the end credits roll was amusing, as the devs added a comparison between the original sprites for each monster in Risk of Rain 1 versus Returns. And man, look at these glow-ups! Colossus definitely got the best makeover. He went from crusty looking rock thing to a walking gothic castle motherfucker. Very cool. But even the new content fits in astoundingly well, such that it wouldn't be very hard to convince me it was actually in the game the whole time. This is something that's extremely commendable. By playing Risk of Rain Returns, you can comfortably say that you've gotten the Risk of Rain 1 experience, even if you technically didn't play the original. Of course, due to the technical issues discussed earlier, the remake nailing this the way it did has surely saved plenty of Risk of Rain fans from the technical pains one might experience by playing the original. This applies to basically everything except the Providence Trials, which are an entirely new concept not originally present. Items, characters, the obtuse unlocks, the stage layouts, enemies, everything new has that Risk of Rain 1 feel to it, which is pretty brilliant. Returns also contains some surprisingly major fundamental changes to the gameplay. In Risk of Rain 1, when you're casting any abilities, you cannot move whatsoever. The only exception to this is Huntress, for whom moving and shooting was her whole gimmick. In Returns, you can move, although quite slowly, as every character while you cast most abilities. This is a fairly big change, and it makes the combat feel just that bit more responsive, and gives you a way of avoiding attacks while firing that isn't just jumping to dodge, an essential piece of tech for surviving any Risk of Rain run. While I was making this video, an update for the game dropped that majorly changes how the control scheme works. By selecting the Risk of Rain 2 control scheme or by separately enabling it, you can actually aim with your mouse, controlling which way your character shoots completely independent of which way they're walking. This is a huge change, making the combat much more fluid and opening up many unique combos and combat tech that couldn't be done before. I'm still a little bit on the fence about this, to be honest, since the combat does kind of feel like a completely different game to Risk of Rain 1. But on the other hand, it's just so damn fun to be able to freely aim and shoot wherever you want. Obviously, you can't aim up or down, still only along the X-axis, but this is still a revolutionary change to the core combat kit of every character. Another change is that you no longer have to slaughter every single enemy on the map before leaving to the next level, just the teleporter boss. This is actually a pretty great update. Having to kill every enemy post-teleporter wasn't really a test of skill, and more of a test of your patience that served to slow down the game significantly. Personally, I'm glad to see this gone. If you want, all of the new content and changes, including the teleporter rework, can be enabled or disabled in this menu, so you can still experience the brutal nature of Risk of Rain 1 as it was originally intended. The Providence Trials themselves are one of the very few things in this remake that I do have minor issues with. Many of them feel more like mastery challenges for the respective abilities that they unlock, and don't teach nor foster any relevant skills to do with the reward. For example, Akrod's Toxic Bubble skill is obtained from a trial that makes you use it as a portable platform, which you must cleverly deploy and use as a parkour aid. But in an actual game, you would basically never use it this way, especially not in such a precise manner. A lot of the trials had this feel to them. You would commonly be made to use an ability in a way it doesn't really feel intended for in the regular game. In a few unfortunate cases, it seems as though particular abilities were designed with a Providence trial in mind, and not the regular game whatsoever, instead of the other way around. The biggest offender here is Artificer's Localized Sun, which is one of the few abilities in this game that I've struggled to find any use for in a normal run of Risk of Rain. This ability tracks using your movement keys, which means it is basically impossible to use and dodge at the same time, outside of the trial situation in which the Artificer is completely encased in stone terrain, with minimal space to move. Unfortunately, many of the alt unlocks do feel quite gimmicky, which is fine, of course, but often they lack practical application in the average playthrough. With that being said, it is fun to have unlockable abilities that aren't mere side grades, or even upgrades, but completely change up the way a character is played. With time, I'm sure the community will unveil alternative ways to use abilities such as these, much like how the pilot's alternate mobility that replaces his parachute with a dash was discovered to have a hidden wave dash movement tech, making it much more powerful. I mean, you can clear entire stages in seconds. Look at him go. Generally, with this sort of thing, more use cases for abilities will gradually come up over time as the community has more time to experiment with them. I'm sure that most abilities will eventually be perceived as having some sort of use, except Localized Sun, of course. The 3 new characters are a major highlight of the remake. Included are 2 completely new faces, the Pilot and the Drifter, and a returning character from Risk of Rain 2, the Artificer, completely revamped for a 2D environment. The Pilot is a refreshingly simple character. Despite being chopped up into multiple pieces by the Heretic, the Pilot shrugged it off, formed himself back together, and jumped into an escape pod. This canon event makes him the strongest character in the Risk of Rain universe. Comparable to Commando, his abilities consist of shoot, shoot up, float, and shoot harder. His playstyle revolves around using his parachutes to float above the enemies out of harm's way and bombard them with his secondary that auto-aims upwards, or downwards if the pilot himself is in the air. This is immensely freeing. Being able to just shoot annoying aerial harassers like jellyfish and archerbugs is a Risk of Rain miracle. Additionally, being able to embody the annoying aerial harassers yourself and float above everything else is simply glorious. Pilot's alternative mobility skill, replacing rapid deployment with aerobatics, gives him an invincibility granting movement ability, similar to Commando. It also enables you to cling to walls and shoot at things like some sort of Spider-Man with violent tendencies. By itself, this ability is a little bit underwhelming, trading off Pilot's valuable airtime for an unreliable wall climb, but it's no secret that the wave dash movement tech is what really makes his ability exciting. With it, Pilot trades his floaty nature for the ability to clear entire maps in a single surge, turning him from graceful aerial bombarder to speedy machine gunner. Overall, this character is an absolute blast, and regardless of which utility skill you pick, turns the way you approach a fight on its head. The next character is Artificer. In Risk of Rain 2, Artie is very much an aerial bombardment character, a role that Pilot has seemingly taken in returns. She can float infinitely for free, and one of her alternate skills propels her sky high. Her abilities have long cooldowns and limited stock, but deal immense amounts of burst damage. In returns, her role has been reworked to be more of a distraction-based area damage shtick. Her ice wall distracts enemies, allowing her to manipulate swarms of enemies into one place and then unleash her flame chakrams, charge nanobombs, and her iconic flamethrower onto them. In a vacuum, there's nothing wrong with this gameplay loop at all, and Artificer is a perfectly capable survivor. Obviously. That being said, her ice wall falls off late game, as enemies will kill it extremely quickly, and because her primary attack is designed with stationary targets in mind, it can be tricky to keep the hordes of monsters tamed when her main tool for manipulating them gets wrecked as quickly as it does. Furthermore, her alternate unlocks are odd. We've talked about Localized Sun, but the ability that replaces Ice Wall, Tectonic Surge, is also a bit strange. It changes out her enemy distracting abilities for a jump that stuns enemies and creates a temporary platform. Having some mobility, even if it's just a little bit, on a character who's focused on burst damage and nothing else, is really nice. But distracting enemies with the wall is kind of her main thing in this game. The temporary platform doesn't really compete with the wall, since Artificer isn't an aerial bombardment character like she is in Risk of Rain 2. Pilot is the only character who can aim up or down, so the platform only really gives her an advantage against large targets. Which is something, but now all the swarms of trash mobs will easily dominate her. I don't know, maybe I just need to experiment with it more. Despite what I've seen some other people say, I really like the nanobomb replacement, Pulse Spear, or as I like to call it, Guitar Hero Simulator. Drifter is the final new addition, and definitely the most unique character in the game. Hell, maybe the most unique character in the Risk of Rain franchise as a whole. Uniquely, she has a resource meter. Hitting enemies will drop scrap metal which fills up the meter, and will power some strong abilities. Both her secondary ability options consume some scrap and are very good at killing things. Her tertiary abilities either a whirlwind, giving greater mobility and a bunch of fast-hitting attacks, or an execute attack that even works on bosses, erasing the target from existence if it's below 20% health, and providing a substantial amount of scrap in exchange. Finally, she can either spawn 4 temporary items, or re-roll a nearby item at the cost of almost all the scrap meter. Drifter is kind of cracked. Getting a bunch of extra items that you probably shouldn't have at any stage of the game, even if they're temporary, is a huge boon. Combine that with an outstanding melee kit, and you get quite possibly the most busted character in the game. Returns also adds a ton of new items, artifacts, drones, alternate skills, etc, etc, etc. But in order to avoid this video becoming overly long, I won't delve too deep into these new additions. Besides, it's more fun to discover them yourself. Risk of Rain Returns is an excellent remake of an already great game. It irons out basically all the kinks, adds new content where it makes sense, and updates everything with a revisited visual style and soundtrack. This game is effectively the gold standard of remakes. I have no doubt that it's going to help many fans of the original 2013 game like myself revisit a hallmark in roguelike games without all the jank, and enable fans of Risk of Rain 2 to enjoy where the series originated from, again without all the jank. At times, I feel like Risk of Rain 1 is a more refined gameplay experience than Risk of Rain 2. 2 is an amazing game, of course, but things being in 3D often has some undesirable side effects. The biggest one, at least for me, is rare gameplay scenarios that are extremely unfun, such as certain bosses being untouchable when you're playing as a melee character, or things appearing out of nowhere right behind you and one-shotting you. Furthermore, Risk of Rain 2 gives you a lot of agency over your run. With the addition of things like lunar coins and the bazaar between time, plus 3D printers and scrappers, players more often than not can intentionally seek out the most broken builds and reliably win the game. In my opinion, this kind of takes away from the roguelike experience. Too much agency certainly means that the game can become too easy and almost risk-free. Considering that cheating in lunar coins, a currency that persists in between runs, is common practice, this gives players a ridiculous amount of leeway, effectively allowing them to choose whatever lunar items they wish in the bazaar. Risk of Rain 1 is free of anything like this. Multi-shops and roulette terminals are the most agency you ever get. This makes the game harder, yeah, but I feel like that's part of what you're signing up for playing a roguelike. You're at the mercy of random number generation, and that's part of what makes it fun. I've had plenty of runs and returns where I've had to work around a mediocre use item, or play extremely patiently, as my items aren't powerful enough to carry the run on their own. This makes returns feel a lot more like that classic rogue experience that Risk of Rain 2 has somewhat deviated from, which I've enjoyed a lot. Aside from that, this game is just hard. Rainstorm difficulty consistently kicked my ass from the get-go, which I wasn't really expecting. I genuinely just think I forgot just how difficult Risk of Rain 1 truly was. Risk of Rain Returns is a brilliant remake of a brilliant game. If you have any interest in the roguelike genre whatsoever, I'd strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic introduction to that category of games, being an extremely refined experience, free of the jank that its predecessor was unfortunately plagued with. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I guess I'll see you next time. Now, it's time for me to go and cry in a corner because Gearbox is making a fucking Risk of Rain gacha game. Oh, God, Jesus Christ.